This is Book Down Planning, a podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current classic books. I'm your host, Steph Rouse. To wrap up the first year of the podcast, we've invited Petra Hurtado, Research Director at the American Planning Association, to talk to us about future trends. Petra has a PhD in urban planning from Vienna University of Technology and is the Research Director at the American Planning Association, heading APA's research programs and foresight practice. In this role, she is responsible for expanding a future-focused research agenda, advancing planning practices that assist communities in navigating change, and developing APA's foresight practice to inform APA's strategic governance. So to wrap up this first year of episodes, we thought we'd focus on future, as many people will start to do with the beginning of 2023 in sight. And so while it's not necessarily a book, APA Foresight is an online resource of the American Planning Association that helps planners navigate change and prepare for an uncertain future. Can you talk about when and how this started and what prompted the development of this resource?
Yeah, so there's a few different, reasons of why and when. So first of all, obviously as planners, we're dealing a lot with the future, and we're planning for the future of our communities. We're aiming to create sustainable and equitable futures for our communities. And that really means that we're taking responsibility for the future. And we live in a world of accelerated change, and it's our responsibility to understand this changing world around us and to work with it. And so what we see in planning is that we don't always consider what is happening around us in our plans. So I'm always saying we need to plan with the future and not just for the future of our communities. And so that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. And in terms of timing, we started our foresight practice about 3 years ago. And that was mainly because we saw all of these changes happening and we saw the need to be able to understand the future better. And that was really for APA as an organization, but also for the planning profession as a whole. And so, as we all know, half a year later, so that was in the fall of 2019, and half a year later, COVID-19 hit. And we knew we were on the right track with this program because the world was upside down. The future became really more unknowable than ever before. And we still don't know what the post-COVID world will really look like. And so we established APA Foresight to make sense of this changing world around us and really to support and help planners and APA as an organization to prepare for these future uncertainties and whatever the future might look like.
Yeah, and one of the big resources as part of that is the Trends Report. You can download it off of the APA website, the 2022 report. And I was reading through it, and it's broken up into 3 categories: things we need to act on now, things that we should prepare for, and then signals to learn and watch. And as we've talked about, planning for the future and trying to decide, what's fads and what are lasting trends is challenging. And so I'm curious how your team decided on which of these were important for planners and city officials to pay attention to and to start thinking about.
That's a great question, and probably the most difficult piece of our work, because, there's so much going on, as I just mentioned, and it's really hard to prioritize and decide what to focus on. And so we have a few different mechanisms for this in our work. First of all, the APA Foresight team, we're only 4 people. We obviously do the heavy lifting with the desk research and all of that, but the 4 of us alone wouldn't be able to do it. And so we have a trend scouting foresight community. That's a group of about 30 people who help us really understand what are some of the shifts and changes and ultimately the trends and signals around us that we want to take a look at. And this is really important in foresight. Diversity is key. So we really need many diverse perspectives that need to go into this work to really be able to make sense of this world around us and of potential futures. And so our foresight community is, people from different backgrounds, different professions, and also different countries. And so, for example, we have planners from different planning fields, but also engineers, public health experts, psychologists, computer scientists, architects, you name it. Obviously, all of these things that come up with this group, we do trend verification with data analysis. And then when it comes to prioritizing the long list of things that usually comes out of these meetings, and really prioritizing what goes into the trend report and when to determine what could be potential future trends that planners should keep watching. So we have a prioritization method for that. So we look, first of all, at the potential impacts of trends or signals. So that can be impacts on the planning profession, but also potential impacts on cities and communities. And we also look at the certainty or uncertainty of something to actually become a trend or to become relevant to planning. And so we put these two factors in a 2x2 matrix, and then we prioritize based on that. So the trends that fall in the quadrant in that matrix where high impact and high certainty meet, those are the ones that we prioritize in our work. So even if we start out usually with a list of 200 to 300 trends, we narrow it down to what's in the trend report, which is about 100 trends based on that prioritization. And that method is also described in the trend report. So everyone can look that up and see if they want to do their own prioritization with that as well.
It'll be really interesting, 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line, looking back at some of these original reports as part of this project to see what's panned out, what tracked as high priority trends that actually started to impact our communities and the profession as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the 2022 trend report, keeping on that, when I was reviewing it, there weren't a lot of surprising things. And I don't think other planners would find a lot of the trends in there as being a big surprise either. A lot of them were driven by climate change. You have the climate innovation and impacts to the climate emergency, along with decarbonization of the transportation system. And some of the other trends, as we talked about the pandemic having a big influence, brought to light a lot of those new major trends, whether it be digitization of everything, major economic restructuring, and equity and inclusivity issues that have been brought to light. How can planners and city officials sort through what's important to start planning for specific to their community? Something that may be high impact to a coastal city might not be the same high impact trend to keep track of in the Midwest.
Absolutely. And this is really important. Obviously, we don't expect planners to take this trend report and use all the 100 trends and just probably burn out with them. So planners obviously also need to prioritize what they want to focus on and what the specifics are for their communities. There's no one size fits all as with everything planning, right? So planners can also use the trend prioritization method that I just mentioned. However, depending on if you're looking more at the existing trends that are in the Act Now timeframe in our report, or if you look at the more future-focused signals, as we call them, you will probably have to change the matrix a little bit. So I would, for example, suggest instead of the certainty or uncertainty factor, when you look at existing trends, you can instead use factors such as how prepared is your community. So you can put in your matrix the impact, the expected impact, and also the question of how prepared is my community. And then you prioritize the quadrant where you have the high impact trends and the low preparedness together. So that's what you want to focus on.
Are you aware of any communities or planners that have done that before, have taken this trend report and really applied it to their community and worked on preparing for some of these trends?
So obviously the trend report is a new thing. So that the first one came out in this January of this year. By the way, the next one is coming out in the coming January, 2023. So I'm really excited about that. So I think in planning in general, the practice of foresight, where we talk about horizon scanning, where we look at trends, but then also scenario planning and backcasting, in that sense is not as popular, I would say, in planning yet as it should be, probably. There are different aspects of foresight that planners have been using. So scenario planning is something most planners are aware of, and some of them are working with it. But the full idea of really including, factors of change that usually we don't even think have anything to do with planning, that's relatively new. I know one really good example from Canada, that's Calgary. They actually have a full foresight practice integrated in their planning program, and they are using foresight the way it's originally known from the business world as strategic foresight, really doing the horizon scanning, scenario planning, the backcasting, and then creating these dynamic plans that you can create once you go through that process.
I'm curious from the trend report from last year, and maybe you can kind of tease 2023 since it's about to come out too, but are there any trends that stood out to you that you think has the most potential or will have the greatest impact on cities?
Yeah, so looking through the report, one thing that's really sticking out is the trend of digitalization of pretty much everything. It's kind of a theme throughout, one could really say, because a lot of new trends or emerging trends come out of this one trend of digitalization, which has been around for about 2 decades, but has really all these different impacts right now. And one could really say, access to the internet today really equals access to jobs, to education, to entertainment, and so many more things in life. So I think that as planners, we will have to really get ready to not just plan for a built environment, but really to plan for a hybrid world. So what are the activities that people will be doing in the real world, and what are the things that can be done in the virtual world? And, these two worlds are really moving closer and closer together. And at some point, I think they really will merge together. And we already saw the impacts from, for example, just virtual work during COVID, with all these people working remotely, the impact on our transportation systems and transportation behavior in the real world that already showed us how these two worlds are connected. And I think there will just be more of that in the future. There are a lot of companies and professions that are asking these questions right now. If you, for example, if you work in the conference space, you're, thinking about what are the things of a conference that have to be in person and what are the things that can be virtual. We are asking these questions at APA as well. And pretty much anyone, any employer and employee are really asking the question of what the hybrid work environment will look like in the future. How can we take advantage of both sides? We see, and our lives are getting more hybrid as well. And so I do think that this is going to be an important topic for planners to be aware of that and really consider both worlds in our work.
That reminds me, I went on a tour of one of our new high schools that just opened up this year, and it was just amazing seeing education and the impact that technology and digitization has on education and how students are learning today, and screens all throughout the entire building. There's no traditional trophy case anymore. It's going to be a computer screen that just projects all of the different awards. And so just seeing those small changes and open space learning formats and these large digital boards instead of whiteboards. Yeah, it's amazing how much technology is changing things, and just knowing that generation is going to be the next generation of planners, and they are growing up in a fully digitized world, and they'll bring that to the profession as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thinking about change, it's hard enough to get people on board with change when it's really obvious and present. I mean, we're seeing this center stage right now with climate change and many communities that are impacted, and there's still a lot of push and pull between trying to get implementation in place to deal with that. So when you're projecting something to happen, such as a self-driving technology that really seems far off and kind of challenging that it might ever happen in our generation, how do you convince city officials or decision makers or even residents that preparation is needed now to adopt things like zoning regulations, design standards, or other planning tools to prepare for that change?
That is a great question. And, that's probably the biggest challenge for everyone who works in foresight, be it in the planning profession or, in the business world or wherever you use foresight. I mean, and coming back to planning, we know planners are extremely busy right now, and burnout is a huge problem right now among planners because there's just so much going on. And with COVID having, really put everything upside down in our cities and communities, it's just getting more and more complex. And so keeping that in mind, I also have to, say, and I mentioned that before, we do have a responsibility toward the future of the communities we make plans for. And we want to plan for a sustainable and equitable future. And it would almost be irresponsible to not consider potential futures in our work. But that said, we also see it as our responsibility at APA that we provide the guidance, the tools, the support, and whatever else planners need so they can do their work and we can help essentially integrate this futures thinking in their work without having to add additional stuff on top of everything else. So that's really our goal at APA. And I do see our responsibility there to really give planners the support so they can use these futures, work with these futures without burning out.
So this one's kind of jumping back to some more specifics on the 2022 trend report, but I was surprised to see that 3D printing was in that third category, the signals to learn and watch list, instead of things that we should prepare for list, the one tier up, because it seems like it's a trend that's becoming more established with many cities seeing things like 3D printed homes to help with affordability issues. And I'm curious what it is about this trend that has it on the learn and watch list and why we should just keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, so depending on who you ask, there's probably many more trends that could live in other different timeframes, depending on the different perspectives or where people live and work. And so that's really important to mention. The timeframes can be very dynamic, also given the pace of change that we are seeing and that we are living in. And so you will see in the next trend report, a lot of these trends have moved to different timeframes, which is, the exciting part about this work too. But so when it comes specifically to 3D printing, there's a couple of things. When we talk about 3D printed houses or homes, there's also a paragraph in the housing section, which is in the Act Now timeframe, because obviously there's already multiple companies who 3D print homes, and it needs to be captured there. However, we also decided to include it in addition in the bigger 3D printing section, which, as you mentioned, is in the Learn and Watch category. And that's mainly because, even though there's so many companies out there now doing this, it's really in many cases still in this pilot phase of, we're trying that in different places, but we don't have the experience yet of how is it really living in these homes. So most of these 3D print companies say that these 3D printed homes will be more sustainable, will be less expensive, and can be printed much faster than conventional homes and conventional construction. And so obviously the first thought is, okay, is this the solution to our affordable housing crisis? We don't want to, come to conclusions before we really learn enough about it. So while on the one hand, I would want to encourage planners to get involved in this and really understand what this is about and what the quality really is. But I also think we will probably know in 5 to 10 years how successful this technology really is, because then we can talk to people who bought these houses and who lived in them for a few years. And so really learning what it really means to have that. But then again, it is an important trend to keep watching and trying to get involved to really learn about it and talk to the people who live in them to understand the experience. And then in addition to that, obviously 3D printed homes are not the only topic when it comes to 3D printing, because there's all kinds of things that companies are trying out right now with this technology. And so one other topic that was also very interesting to us is 3D printed infrastructure systems. We mentioned a bridge that was 3D printed in Amsterdam. And then there's also a pilot project going on in the UK for a railroad that is being 3D printed. And so obviously these are all in the very beginning stage. These are all pilots, and they sound also very interesting because, again, if you can build infrastructure much cheaper and much faster, that's obviously something we want to be able to use, but we still need to, learn more about and see how these pilot projects work out. And then, going further, we are asking the question of, if you in the end can 3D print everything, what will that mean for many, many different industries? So we see a lot of disruption there, positive or negative, but if you can really 3D print everything at some point, the question is, how will that affect supply chains and retail? If you just go online, you pick a design of whatever you want to buy, be it a piece of furniture, shoes, or whatever else you need, and you go to your local 3D print store to get it printed. So what would that mean, for communities, for retail? And that's obviously something that is far out in the future, and something we want to just keep watching this industry to see where it goes, so we don't get the big surprise once it's happening.
Okay, so it seems kind of like until something has proven that it's not just a fad or something that's was a great idea that just doesn't actually pan out in real life. That's what separates it from the watch list to really needing communities to start planning for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, a lot of crazy things some people say in our watch list, but they have relevance. And obviously it's also based on facts. So I always also mention what's really important for us is that only because something is in our trend report doesn't mean APA thinks this is great or needs to be endorsed. So when we talk about, for example, Jeff Bezos going to space, we're not saying this is good or bad. It's something that's happening. And we feel like if this is becoming a bigger trend or at some point even mainstream, there are many, many impacts to be thought about, not just in outer space, but also down on Earth.
Yeah, that's a good point. This next question is kind of broad. Do you see any ways that the planning profession in general needs to evolve and adapt to meet the changing world that we're seeing?
So there are two main things that really immediately come to mind. First of all, planning really needs to become more proactive than reactive. Right now, there's a lot of disruption happening, but we always react to it and we don't proactively prepare for it. For example, with the iPhone, a lot of things changed in our communities and no one really prepared for technology like that. And now we see disruption with transportation network companies or shared micromobility like scooters where we don't know what to do with them. So had we, known about these developments in other industry sectors, we could have, prepared for them and maybe be ready when, in this case, transportation systems hit the road and know what to do and maybe avoid or prevent that disruption from happening. And connected with that or related to that, the second part or the second thing that I'm seeing will be needed in the evolution of the planning profession is really to become more futures literate. And I think that's something that really applies to any profession these days. But I always say, as planners, we do a lot with the future. We shape the future of our communities, really. And so to be able to really shape the future in a responsible, sustainable, and equitable way, we also need to be able to imagine what the future might look like. So really understanding how we can use the future in our work, or better, even like use multiple plausible futures in our work, because we really don't know what the future will look like. We can start preparing for alternative options of what the future could look like. And I think that's what we need to start learning on how we can do that in planning. So really learning how to plan with the future, considering all these external drivers of change that we might not be aware of right now. And, considering innovations from other sectors and just really being aware of a changing world around us.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about the scooters and not being prepared for that. And I think that was one advantage of being a smaller Midwest city is that we saw the negative impacts of scooters popping up overnight in the major metro areas, and they were scrambling to react to that technology. Whereas a couple years later, when companies were finally going to other cities throughout the nation, we were able to learn from their mistakes, set up parameters ahead of time, and make sure we had addressed all the issues of what that technology would do to our transportation system. So sometimes the future hitting our communities a little later than some of the major metro areas gives us the opportunity to learn and prepare a little bit better.
Yeah, that might be the case with this trend. There's obviously other trends in specifically rural communities that, will be more relevant there and might be specific to these communities. So it's really important to, no matter where you are, to keep an eye out for shifts and things that might turn into bigger trends or disruptors.
Yeah, and it can seem very burdensome, I think, for planners, because you mentioned before how a lot of planners are getting burnt out. We're working on so many different projects and trying to advance things, and then trying to also keep track of trends and things that could be impacting the future of our work it's like a second job almost. And so I think we could do a better job at conferences and webinars and trainings of having specific sessions or kind of engagement around this type of future trends and keeping track of what's coming down the line and what could impact our communities on a local level too.
Yeah, and we have to keep in mind that these, developments and changes and in a lot of cases, technological innovations, they will happen with or without us as planners. And so I always say it's better for us to be involved and have a seat at the table and be able to steer directions and really steer it in a positive, again, sustainable and equitable direction than, ignoring it or saying, yeah, I don't want to deal with this. I don't like this or whatever it may be. And then the disruption happens without us being able to do something about it. I also want to mention, but because you said, it's like an extra or an additional job to take care of the future and all these changes around us. That's something that I mentioned earlier. We really want to, help planners to see how they can integrate that kind of work in the work that they are already doing. So there's ways to integrate foresight into a community visioning process or into a comprehensive planning process. And that's really what we need as planners. So we already have, the tools and methods that we use to plan for the future. Now we just need to integrate the future into those processes. And, there's, again, I see the responsibility with us at APA to provide the tools and trainings that are needed to be able to do that. We also started an upskilling initiative this year where it's really about looking at, what are some of the skills that planners will need in the future based on the many changes that are happening around us. So, in addition to the continuing education that you want to do for your professional development, you also need to think about how you can upskill so you are able to tackle emerging trends and future trends. And, there's a lot of topics coming out, obviously related to equity, diversity, inclusion. You see skills gaps there that we want to fill as APA, but then there's also, skills gaps related to what we are talking about here, which is, how can you use the future in your work? How can you become more futures literate? And so there's actually a course coming out on this topic in January, end of January, that will be about how to use the future in planning and how to create dynamic plans with that future.
Like you said, we're, as planners, especially planners that work a lot in long range planning, are set up to do this. I mean, we project populations and how the community will physically grow, but I think taking it the next step to actually plan for some of these major trends as well will really benefit our communities.
Absolutely.
So to wrap up the first year of hosting the Booked on Planning podcast, we had asked our listeners to submit their thoughts on what the next big idea would be for the field of planning. In our conversation, we've been talking more broadly about upcoming themes in the world of planning, but thinking more specifically on concepts like previous trends that have kind of stuck around, like new urbanism or form-based codes. Do you have any thoughts on what the next big idea for the field would be if you had to pick just one?
Yeah, if I may pick two, and they're actually pretty closely related, so I can make one out of if needed. But, really coming back to this topic of digitalization, I do think that's really the big thing where we as planners really have to dive into deeper than where we are right now and really thinking more broadly about this idea of planning for a hybrid world, really understanding both worlds there, but then really also related to that, really, because it's also coming out of the development of information and communications technologies, is the idea of co-creation enabled by these technologies. So I do think, and I mean, we see that in Europe already, but it's developing in the US more and more as well. It's really this a much more actively engaged community, the idea of the citizen planner, who's not just, almost passively participating in the planning processes that we as planners really provide and sometimes prescribe, but a citizen planner who can really actively create change in their communities through means of communication, that used to not be around, be it through social media and others, and then also through open source tools. We see more and more of these artificial intelligence-based tools popping up that everyone can really use for free. And then obviously connected with that also open and accessible data that everyone can use. So I think co-creation is really something that we need to keep an eye on and obviously as planners know how to do it and really encourage our communities to do it. So everyone, can be part of the change that is created and also to be a change agent in their community.
Very interesting. To wrap up, is there anything else that we didn't get to today that you think is important for our listeners to know?
A lot of times when we talk about the future or about foresight, we kind of think of like crystal balls and sci-fi, and the truth is really we can't predict the future. So that is really important to mention. Foresight is not about predicting the future. It's more about being prepared or starting to prepare for all these alternative outcomes, all these different options of what the future could look like. And, and I mentioned that before, only because we talk about spaceships and robots, that doesn't mean that those are great ideas. A lot of people think, okay, now they're talking about spaceships. Now APA is going completely nuts, but that's really not what it is. And it's like this keeping an open mind, considering things in our work that we personally may not, agree with, but really taking on this responsibility to create awareness about these things. And, in the end, we are the ones who are responsible for the consequences of our actions today. And future generations will have to deal with those. And I think it's just really our responsibility to include the future in our work and be responsible for what we're doing.
Well, I think that's a really great way to end this episode. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us and looking forward to the 2023 trend report.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. And the release date is January 25th, so put that on your calendars.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll have to link out to that on our website once it's available.